Welcome to Mental Health, It's a Trap. We're your hosts, Susan and Stephen, mother and son, unravel the complexities of the mental health traps people fall in. Join us on this podcast journey as we demystify the mental health labyrinth, explore common issues, and provide you with tools to navigate this sometimes extremely daunting terrain. You can expect engaging conversations, personal stories, and probably also have a laugh or two. Access to mental health care should not be what causes you additional stress. We invite you to follow along and we can embrace the darkness together.
All right. Hello, you awesome listeners. Today we have an awesome guest, and I'm just going to ask, do you prefer Gabriel or Gabe?
I don't have a preference, but most people call me Gabe.
Okay, cool. I think that's probably its own different topic, because I feel like even with my name being Stephen, I've always been Stephen with a PH, but a lot of people tend to similarly shorten my name to Steve, and although I don't necessarily fully have a preference, I'm always like Stephen when they ask, but I don't correct them when they say Steve.
Mm-hmm. And people also call me Gabrielle. There's so many interesting moments where we're trying to figure out who I am and what's going on.
Well, we definitely appreciate you being on the show. And if you wouldn't mind just kind of introducing yourself to the audience, just who you are, what you do, and kind of some of the services that you provide.
Yeah, so my name is Gabriel Vega. I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor in New Hampshire and Vermont. I have been working, I guess my origin story is I was working with at-risk youth in Pike, New Hampshire, and that's very interesting. I'm from New Jersey, so I think going from the city and working with at-risk youth in the farm was quite the entertaining thing for those kids to see me like, I don't know what to do with this cow. We're supposed to be in therapy. So it really started with I was in a class and somebody saw how just animated and excited I was to work with at-risk youth, and she was like, hey, I think you would be great for the kids on the farm. And that was a really kind of how I started to get into mental health and seeing like, wow, there's a lot of youth that are left behind, a lot of sad stuff, but also, again, a lot of cool stuff. So specifically with me, after all that time, I landed in assessment right now. So I have 60 to 90 days to assess kids from all over, 11 years old to sometimes 18, 19, depending on diagnoses and things like that. And that's like a speed round. So sometimes I get kids who are 17, have been in a household full of substance abuse, have one credit in high school, and I'm trying to figure out what happened, why, and then what does this person need? We're looking at everything from academic needs to residential, right? So if this kid is suicidal or if they don't even have dental work done, right? We have a lot of kids with their mouths rotting. We're kind of hitting the ground running, trying to get all sorts of things assessed, which helps us determine, okay, where are we going next? If this kid is suicidal, but they're 17 and have a lot of skills, how do we make sure we deal with that mental health part, connect them with somebody who's going to make sure that doesn't fall apart while we're kind of getting them at a job, or we might be trying to get them into college. So my job's kind of like almost like parenting, a lot of social work, crisis work with them. Like right now I have a kiddo who's turning 18 pretty soon. So we are in meetings daily, kind of figuring out apartments. How is he going to get insurance or his medication? So it goes from assessment to then where we know our direction, we then start to say, okay, we need to figure out how this kid can learn, skills. If he's not going to go to college, can we send him to automotive? Because my job has really cool ways where you can learn how to fix cars or you can learn how to do electrical work. So we tried to give them options. Maybe you didn't have it good now, but maybe you're a little bit better than your trauma. Maybe you're someone who can fix cars or be a leader in some other ways. So it's a really cool place because I do the assessment and then I do long-term helping them launch into adulthood. And I think into that, when I read your about me, it really resonated, kind of like your burnout leading to your work into this, because that's kind of where I am. I am feeling almost like a lot of broken systems, which lead to a lot of adults who are broken. So I kind of jumped to the other end to provide trauma-informed treatment for adults, because I just feel like seeing how many kids, 60 to 90 days, or even sometimes a year, it is not enough to address some of the trauma that they're going through. So it's the assessment, it's launching them into adulthood, and then I'm finding all those adults and trying to figure out what happened and what didn't happen to them, and how are we going to like move forward after that. Does that answer that?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a lot.
Yeah, I always think about that. I'm like, I'm about to go on a rant here.
Well, I mean,
that's okay.
Yeah, I think that's a part of breaking things down. So, like, when we think about trauma, it's like there are a lot of factors that go into it. It's not usually just one thing. It's kind of like it could be one thing that happens, and then as you get older into an adulthood, it's like one of those things where it's like, I don't want to go to therapy because I don't want to talk about my childhood. But then again, there's a point in therapy where sometimes you get there because there are unresolved issues that, when unaddressed, it still impacts, even if you get better or heal in therapy. Like, if you still have that a core wound, if we'll say, if that's not addressed, but you kind of fix around it, it's still there.
Yeah, and you're up against a lot of agencies who are kind of like, well, they're 17, they're about to be 18. We need to get it together. You know, you need to be an adult. And I always tell people, like, trauma does not care how old you are. And it's a really tough lesson. Yeah, like, it's a tough lesson to see an 18-year-old who gets a lot of resources, but the trauma is so significant. You watch it all crash and burn, and it's like, oh, man. Or you can give them all the therapy and...
Yeah, well, I think the one thing that I worked in community mental health before I went into primary care, and I do private practice as well. And trauma has always been a passion of mine. And I've always felt about, let's get to the children, because then we can have functioning adults. So, you know, in our society, we're doing it backwards. We're waiting for the trauma to manifest into adulthood. And it's sometimes, for some people, it's so set, and they get so stuck in it, that if we could get to the children, and then think about, I know in the state of New Hampshire, we have very limited resources for children. And so we get them as adults, either through their primary care doctors or in community mental health centers or in at-risk youth detention facilities, you know, whatever that is. And we're trying to fix things with, my hope is like, let's fix them earlier on so that we're not working, and they're not having to work as hard to try to figure out their life as an adult. And us, you know, and I liked, you know, one of the big things in this Mental Health is a Trap podcast is really like the broken systems that we have to navigate, and becomes a really big barrier for providers and for clients as well to get the support and help they need, and being able to listen to what their needs are and not bringing in what we think their needs are.
That is the hardest part, because, like, you know, I'm working with 17-year-olds who are traumatized by these systems. They've been failed. They have a lot of valid points. And then we're sometimes asking them to trust these same people to help you launch into adulthood. It's a wild experience. And it is a lot of their perspective, helping the clients kind of validate, like, of course, this was horrendous. However, we still have to use these resources, or the little we have, because you're right, I'm coming here kind of thinking about the lack of resources, right? So I'm in this conversation with you both, while in the background, I know any moment I can have my 17-year-old call to say, hey, this apartment didn't go through, or hey, this thing is going on and I'm leaving, you know, in 7 days. So it's really, you're up against some real deal. You need to help them. Sometimes they don't want the help. Sometimes everybody's fighting about what they think they need or want. So it's a lot of heated conversations out of care, and fear of the time is like taken for some of these teenagers.
Right. And a lot of times a lot of people, I've been in it myself, and it's like pass the buck. It's not a medical issue. It's a mental health issue. I'm like, yeah, well, let's sit down and talk about it, because I'm telling you that the symptoms that this patient is experiencing is not anxiety.
Yep.
So let's speak about the medical side, and then I can deal with the mental health side, and we can work together. And I think that the way that our structures are within our systems is productivity models, you know, patients in and out. It's almost like a drive-through kind of experience.
Absolutely.
In the mental health system, in the medical, I mean, even like in hospital settings, it's like you're in and out. Oh, you just had brain surgery, you go home the next day. Again, it's just, I mean, there's pros and cons to that. Less room for infection if you're at home than in a hospital setting and things like that. Though just the care of being able to, you know, get what we need and not be saying, oh, well, you know, hey, you're grieving, let me send you to the emergency room. Why would you send someone to the emergency room for grief?
Yep.
And then the emergency rooms are upset with providers because they're like, why do you keep sending people here for things that we can't manage?
And I'm on the phone sometimes. Sometimes I'm with the hospital. Sometimes I'm with faculty who are just, you know, terrified, right? We're trying to launch people into adulthood while there's mental health doesn't care about that. And then you have another overwhelmed system that is like, is it that bad? And I'm like, sir, it's bad. Like, why are we arguing right now? And it's a lot.
It is a lot. It is a lot. And you also do private practice as well.
I do. I work with those who've survived complex developmental trauma, some pretty acute cases, just because I don't know what else I would do. I feel like if I did generalized stuff after seeing how bad, like, the foster care system can do some of these people, I just really wanted to get into treating dissociative identity disorder. You know, I can do simple PTSD, but I'm really jazzed up about, you know, the kids who had parents who were taking substances since they were pregnant with the kid. And then they're born into all this domestic violence. And then they're put into foster care. And people tell these people, you know, you got to get a grip and move on when the brain has completely been changed. And I see these adults in my private practice who have been brutally beaten down by life. And it's like, I'm so sorry. There's nothing wrong with you. You have significant trauma and people don't get that. Private practice has been my, like, healing end of the broken system of being able to, like, really see non-mandate clients who finally see the value can now come and do that work while we're not maybe, like, trying to find an apartment or survive, like, our first year at college or something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of like how to meet all the basic needs.
Yeah.
Including a sense of self and all of that, right? With trauma, with the amount of trauma that people experience, and, you know, being able to navigate the systems and, like, really teaching people that it's okay to challenge the systems. It's okay to challenge providers, you know, as long as you're respectful and you communicate that. Right? Because, you know, I've sat with some pretty heated people over my years, and, you know, people standing in my office towering over me screaming, and I just sit there and wait till they're done and then say, okay, so how you feeling now? You got all the energy out? Now let's problem solve. You know, though it's really challenging. I know when I worked in community mental health, I would sit with my clients and make the phone calls with them to model how to advocate, model how to, you know, manage frustration when it comes up because you're not being heard.
Yeah.
And so when you work with the kids, are you the one that does a lot of the advocating for connection with services? Do you involve the teens in that?
Yeah, so I actually do 11 assessments with the teenagers I assess. So we're looking at everything from depression, anxiety, PTSD, personality disorders. And my job is to actually talk to the lawyers, the judges, and everyone and say, maybe we don't want to excuse the behaviors that this kid or this family might be here, but I really am trying to, like, advocate for people, even if they make terrible decisions. I'm trying to get to the core of those wounds. Why would somebody do something this awful? Do you really think people just wake up and choose to have a horrible life? Is kind of my tone in my reports. And I'm educating people. I'm sending, you know, people give me a lot of grief about how long my reports are, but I'm saying this isn't a car. I'm sending you a 38-page report because I'm taking mom's history, dad's, grandma, whoever. There's so much involved. And I have to be very, you know, like, after this, I'm going to be working on a report because they're so important to me. People don't realize mental health isn't about your 9 to 5. Sometimes it's like, I need to slow down. I need to make sure this judge and this parole officer and everybody really understands what do these assessments mean and how are we going to move forward in a way where the kid's not going to get arrested, where they're not going to hurt somebody. But again, it takes, you're up against a lot of people. You're up against parents where I sit in these meetings. I'm just the messenger. I just assessed everyone. Here's what I think. And people are screaming at you, like you said, about things where you're like, I get it, mom, but like dad, but I'm just trying to tell your son's perspective in this whole how we're going to figure out moving forward. So it's actually the most frustrating part is the advocacy, because then you start to see everyone cares so much that sometimes we end up battling each other and forgetting like the kid's important because we're so frustrated with the system, and everybody's trying to be like, well, in my office, and I'm like, well, in my clinical obligations, and it gets really heated because it's humans, it's a person on the line at the end of the day.
Do you feel like you see that more with the legal system, like with the justice system? There seems to be a lot of disconnect in those systems with the mental health system.
Mm-hmm. Because think about it. I'm approaching adults who their whole life have been told to shut up and just grab yourself by the bootstraps and deal with it. So when I say, hey, we might want to be trauma informed, I've had people throw trauma informed papers at me, or I've had principals or other people go, yeah, well, the real world doesn't care about your trauma, and then nobody's seen that like the system is so about reaching their goals, right? The lawyer wants to do their job, the parole officer, but sometimes they do their job so well, it almost destroys things because they're not seeing the nuances in what they're doing and like the reality of like our teenagers are in crisis. I mean, in New Hampshire recently, they got rid of beds. So like when I have a client who is suicidal, I'm trying to advocate for these things. Sometimes kids are waiting 8 months for a bed just to get services when they're in crisis. What are you supposed to do for 8 months? So you're not even just dealing with that. It's like the whole system seems to be almost like we're throwing babies off of this cliff, right? And we keep catching them, but like, who's throwing these kids over there? What are we,
Right. It's tough.
It is.
Mm-hmm. It's just one big hot mess because, as it was said, passing the buck, it's not my problem, it's your problem, or it's a this or it's a that. Mm-hmm. And even, like you said, like dealing with like mandated therapy, and even with adults, oftentimes it might not even work because they're being forced to do something that they don't want to do. So there's that resistance piece, which makes it harder for the therapist to do the work because they have to get the resistance down before they can get to the problem. Even if they get to the problem, because maybe insurance gives you 8 to 12 sessions or that whole side of it. And so it just makes it harder for people to get, whether you call it healing or transformation. Mm-hmm. Because, again, if they're not, sometimes they're not aware, right? And I think that can impact them being able to grow because they don't have that insight.
Yeah.
And when they're younger, their brains aren't developed. And so it's like, how do we help them when the history is like, oh, you're 18, you're an adult, so you should have, you're in college, you have a job, you need to pay your bills.
Yeah.
And if you're not teaching them that in high school, how do you expect them to be an adult at 18 and do that stuff?
Right. It's terrifying, and it's sometimes very messy. It is very, very messy, and you kind of come home going like, did I do enough? Is that my fault, right? The passing the buck. There's some court hearings where they'll be like, the clinician didn't do this or that, and you're sitting there after a year of the hardest work you've done for this kid, and the systems are kind of doing really well not to be guilty for the failures that are there for these kids. And yeah, it's a lot of mental fortitude needed.
Exactly. And I think like one of the biggest things that I struggle with is like this box mentality, right? In our systems, in classrooms, if you don't sit in your chair and you don't sit up and you don't pay attention, if you fidget, there's something wrong with you, right? You have ODD or you have ADHD, so we're labeling children. And children are generally need to be moving, and our curriculums in schools don't really support that, right? I know with my youngest, when she was in school, she struggled with some pretty significant anxiety and had to do a lot of advocating from kindergarten all the way through high school. Yeah. And I literally would say to the teacher, like, can she just get up and move in the classroom? Which wasn't an option. And I'm like, why? I don't understand that. Like, all these kids should be moving.
Yeah.
She had one teacher in second grade. Every half hour, this teacher got all the kids up. They did jumping jacks. They ran around the room. She let them move. It was beneficial to her because she had arthritis and she needed to move. So it actually
Yeah.
was a win-win for her
Yeah.
and the kids. But it was like, all right, so I had to get creative and put like felt stuff under her desk, like I could Velcro it, put elastics around her chair so that she could have some movement, right? And we just don't do that. We don't do that in any professional setting. It's like, here's a box. We're going to stick you in this box, and you have to conform to the box. We are human beings. We can't be boxed. That's one of my biggest pet peeves in life. Is like, and we hear this saying, think out of the box. Sometimes we go above and beyond the box because that's really where the people are. They're not inside the box. So, that just came up as you were talking about like the systems and things. And that's one of my experiences that I've seen in my years of whether in the education system, the mental health system. We're human beings. We come with a lot of emotion and a lot of experiences, good, bad, and ugly. And,
Yeah. Yep.
you can't just expect us to conform to whoever created these boxes.
Yep. And
I want
especially
to put them in a box.
right, and especially when you think about like how trauma affects the brain, some of these kids are not even in their right mind. Like genuinely, like you think about how much sexual abuse in New Hampshire across the country, and how many kids like had parents who threatened their kids, and then were like, why aren't they doing their algebra when their parents are trying to murder each other? Or there's a lot that we need to be in class, we need to be productive, and I'm like, we won't have a country if we do not address this mental health crisis. It's that serious. It's like these are our future lawyers, doctors are the traumatized youth that need a little bit more than people arguing, well, who didn't do this, or who forgot to do this one thing for the kid, when we should have probably been prepared years in advance for them turning 18.
Exactly. I know. And it was like interesting, made me think about a client I had worked with back in the day. He was 19, he was young. And he came in mandated with his little ankle bracelet and all that. It was mental health court or go to jail.
Yeah.
And was not receptive to therapy. And I just sat and looked at him one day. I said, listen, dude, this is your time. You can use it any way you want. Though the court is requiring you to participate in your therapy. So we can play board games. We can talk about what's gotten you here. Like, you let me know. And interestingly, and I had him for a few years, he turned around and took his medications and explored his substance use and all of those things and all the trauma he experienced when he was in a manic episode and not taking his meds and things like that and getting into all kinds of trouble. And I'm like, listen, you can do whatever you want. You just can't do it illegally.
Yeah. Because
and just being like honest and open and real with people. That's kind of really what they're looking for. They're not looking for us to, they go to therapy thinking we're going to fix them. But I said, listen, if I had a magic wand, I'd use it on myself and then I would share it. So,
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Well said. Yeah. And yeah, our kids do feel like certain things are magic bullets, or parents or referrals, and people do say, well, they've been in therapy for 2 years. Why are they still acting this way, when they don't realize, for people with significant complex trauma, sometimes I'm working with them for 5 to 9 years. And people are like, well, they're 18, they're an adult. And it's like, yep, but we have so much work to do.
Well,
Right.
I think the flip side is also, and I've said this before, like not to blame the parents. A part of it is on the parents, because if they're not doing their own work and their trauma or abuse comes from parents, or even neglect, which I think people overlook, right? So if a child is getting severely neglected because the parent has to work, 2 to 4 jobs, and they have other children, and they have to pay for the bills and pay for the food and get them to school, and like they don't have time to, not be loving and caring, but they don't have that ability to like hold space for what a child needs in terms of just love and care and attention. And then, like your mom said, it comes out, and then they get labeled, these, brats, or the quote unquote bad kids. And it's like, they're behaving in a way, in a sense, that gets them attention. So how can we get to the core and support the child versus like blame them and then call them a bad kid, and then that just goes back into the child feeling, I am a bad kid because I behave like this and they say it is, so it must be true. So now I have to keep acting like this, and it's more of a unconscious thing that's happening in their brains because they're growing and they don't understand it, and so it's behavioral versus like an actual choice. So like sometimes when people are like, oh, they're making the decision, it's like they're learning and they don't know better, and if you don't teach them and support them, then how do they get there?
Right.
I don't think people understand trauma though, and and development, right? So if a child is significantly traumatized at a young age, they get stuck in that age. And that's the piece that, so people are like, why aren't you making progress? Why aren't you over it? Get over it. And, you went to therapy, and, it's children live what they learn. And so when they're learning that abuse is normal in my house, or substance use is normal in my house, or domestic violence, like that, those are normal things. So they, it's having to relearn for them what's healthy.
Yeah. It's as simple as like a meal. I've had kids who didn't have consistent meals through the day that come in the building and go, wait, we get meals and a snack? And just that, because they've had to starve themselves for survival, we're constantly reminding them you can drink water, you can eat when you want, you have to nourish yourself to make better decisions. So yeah, it goes pretty deep on some of the stuff they missed out and saw and experienced. And when you look at a flashback, part of what I do is I also train all the new faculty across facilities, and I get to show them flashbacks. I get to show them how the timekeeper of the brain isn't even online. It's not even activated when you look at the blood flow and all the things going on there. So we're asking people, we know if diabetics, their blood sugar gets low, we know what we need to do. When someone's having a trauma response, people are rolling their eyes, they are blaming, they're calling the cops, wait a minute. We now see that the brain is going through some significant, chemical changes, and it's helpful when people start to go, oh, wow. Some people leave my trainings and realize that they are significantly traumatized and didn't even understand what that meant. So it really starts with that education and that advocacy, because, people, they don't get it. And if they do, I think the other side is, if you tell a principal just what they're trying to avoid, it gets scary, right? Because then you have to really realize you have a bunch of teachers or a bunch of nurses, whoever, who are really traumatized, and we need to do something about it. So I think there's a level of people dodge me because there's going to be a lot of work to do if we really, want to address some stuff here.
Right.
So when you're working,
I know. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, when you work with like complex developmental trauma, are there any specific ways in which you work with it?
Honestly, I really love your work with breath work and body work, because trauma is not talk therapy. And that's why a lot of veterans and people, I've been talking about this for 32 years, right? So I think for me, I'm EMDR trained, so I'm all about eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. And I'm also deep brain reorienting, which is bottom up, basically like your brain stem. Since you're a baby, you are turning towards or away from distressing things. And then EMDR is all about when you're asleep at night and you're in that fast REM sleep, that back and forth, if we mimic that when you're awake, it really helps people with their trauma work. So it's a lot of teaching kiddos about energy and their body and how they're not their thoughts, but also teaching them first from the body. Like our kids, you can't even get to them if they're not well fed, if they didn't play basketball and they didn't get some energy out. So we start by just routines and rhythms that help their body and help them be there and feel good in it. And then from there, I think they're in a better space to actually care about when I say breathing or why, So it's a lot of body stuff. I connect it with substance abuse. I talk about the vagus nerve and how, it's not smoking a bowl, but it's similar if you really work on your breathing and what you're aiming for, that tension you're trying to work on. So it's teaching young men who really have been taught to not pay attention to their body, how healing and how trauma informed it is to like be hydrated, don't starve yourself, like don't push yourself in this basketball game. So there's a lot of cool work like that where we don't have to talk about much, but if we mountain bike or if we go out to the goats or the cows, you know, there's a lot of work being done by just moving their body and maybe just being in silence with their therapist.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of trauma work is, you know, because if we're asking people to disclose and talk about their trauma, sometimes it's re-traumatizing in and of itself. And
Absolutely.
just, you know, I did a lot of trauma work over at the community mental health center that I worked at, and I would take people outdoors and we would touch trees and we would lay in grass. And again, it's just that we'd walk around the town, around the buildings, and you know, just to have movement because, you know, it's hard just sitting in an office in the box and just talking about stuff. And so, you know, I had some clients do plant therapy. They would just pot plants in my office, or we'd plot, you know, we did a garden outside. Again, it's just kind of being able to notice it in your body too, because I don't think we do a lot of body work in our culture, and we store a lot of trauma in our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I know we've done some like grief work sessions and, you know, breath work sessions for grief and, you know, and just anything else that comes up. And it's interesting that more times than not, we don't even know it's stored in our bodies, most of us.
Right. That's how dissociation works. Like this whole like I cannot fully realize, and the more we learn, like we now know there's actual isolated neural networks. When you say that they're stuck at that age, there really is sometimes this 5-year-old that has never been able to fully express or do certain things, run away, push away, get away, really reenacting that, and our kids feel like they're going crazy when they don't understand how the trauma's affecting their brain. You know, when you finally tell a kid it's a flashback, you know, that's a night terror, and they explain what's happening in their brain, it's really relieving and rewarding to just be like, you're not crazy. You got some really bad trauma, and we can work on it, you know?
Yeah. Wow. So, Stephen, I know you had a few things in the email that you had sent. I didn't know if you wanted to address any of that, like.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of talking about it. I mean, it's kind of like going in and out. And in terms of like, I mean, I want to make sure like when we end that we give some tips and tricks for people who might be listening and maybe they're like going like, oh, like, you know, the light bulb's going off, or they're like, oh yeah, I've had, you know, this is how my family was, or, you know, helping. And that's the part, right? Educating is like that awareness of helping people to understand, because I think even when we use the word like dissociate, people are like, what is that? But it's also, it's a very powerful protective factor that people dissociate so that if they're going through things, something like a sexual abuse, you don't want to be in that moment. So you might dissociate, and then as you get older, that might be something you do even in your intimate lives where you have consent, but you're not aware that you're necessarily doing it, or you are and you aren't, which is the hard part.
Correct. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How can you be present in that moment to understand it if you don't, you know, depending on the partner you have, if they're not a loving partner who can kind of be there with you and they can feel safe enough to be like, when we have sex, like, I'm not there, without the partner being like, like, how can you not be there and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, again, that trauma response. But again, if they're not, or if they haven't had the ability to have those conversations, it's a lot difficult to kind of deal with that kind of trauma, because then they're just like, this is just my life and this is just what I have to deal with. So I'm just going to keep doing it.
Yeah, and that's survival. That's trauma at its core. Like, I'm going to survive this, even if it's miserable. Yeah, and just for dissociation, just to talk on that a little bit more, I think it's important. There's a lot of adults doing it to survive the lack of housing, food insecurity, people not being able to pay their rent or help their kids in moments, you know, multiple streams of consciousness, both aware and unaware. You know, think about the people who survived this 84-car pileup and they felt themselves going blank in death. Right, that was really necessary while they're hearing people burn up. But then when you have an adult who is a functioning CEO and they're blacking out and ending up some places they don't remember after being triggered, it really helps to teach people, the chronic forgetfulness, the intrusive thoughts, the conflicts inside might be some of that unresolved trauma trying to play out. And most people think, doesn't everyone feel this way? And it's like, no, not everyone's brushing their teeth and hearing their abuser, their parents criticizing them. Not everybody has intimacy and feels like they blacked out from having sex, but they know they did. It's a lot of education and kind of allowing people to question their life and themselves. Like, is this actually you? Is this your life? Is this normal?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So how would you define dissociation to our listeners?
Yeah, so dissociation, I have a couple
layman terms.
Yeah, so not being able to fully realize. People have symptoms like chronic forgetfulness. They might disremember doing things, buying things. Dissociation can look like trances. We actually learned that dissociation can be physical. You might get so triggered that you have a 3-hour nap. And we now realize that people are creating, chemicals similar to like morphine and cannabis that when you're dissociating, your brain's doing its best to manage being annihilated, manage trying to deal with something that's inescapable, unbearable, confusing. So dissociation is honestly, I think, this protective factor that checks people out. It really just doesn't allow them to sit with that sexual abuse, or it doesn't allow them to fully feel the hunger of that household that never feeds them. But then, when they're in the real world and you're always numb or checked out, that's a problem. And when we look at brain scans of dissociation, we see that there's nothing going on in the brain when some people are checking out. There's like no blood flow, the amygdala, nothing's really activated. So we know that not fully realizing, the brain is almost like turning itself off and going, we're not going to think about the fact that we're in an 84 car pileup or that dad is drunk again and about to hit us. So it works really well, sometimes too well, right? When our clients just can't remember anything and they're ending up in places and doing things they shouldn't probably. Does that help?
Right. I think that's a good way. And one of the, I don't know, it just gets stuck in my brain of just compartmentalizing, right? So where things just kind of disperse. And so we're not fully aware of different parts that are happening, whether it's in the body or the brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I think about like car accidents. I had been in a car accident where I hit a deer, and
Oof.
I don't really recall it. I remembered up until I hit the deer, and then
Associative amnesia.
and it was like the brain just going, oh, like just. I thought the deer was stuck to the front of my van. It's just like,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was, someone pulled over and helped me, and he was like, you need to call the state police. And I was like, do you have the number? He goes, 911. I go, well, it's not really an emergency. No one's dead. I got the car over to the side of the highway. We're good.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was that whole, I can't even describe what it was like. I just felt like it was an out-of-body experience, weird thing.
Yeah, and that's that dissociative piece, and people describe like parts of self. So the way I learned it is, you and all of us on this, when we're in this conversation, we call that an apparently normal part. Apparently normal self is engaged in conversations. They don't want to be thinking about our own trauma while we're having this conversation. The emotional parts, the fragmented pieces that happen in those traumas, they're still almost in this reliving always. So when we have people who survive cults, when we have people who survive all these things, there's a genuine part of self who continues to relive those things, which is why people feel such internal conflict, such disconnect, such fogginess, tranciness, because they're doing their best to not sit with. I've had clients who all of a sudden remember horrific things that they really could never sit with. And we see now how that dissociation has helped them function for a very long time, not remembering that terrible thing in your family that is now in the forefront of your brain.
Right. Yeah. Whew. That's some intense work to do too, and so being able to take care of yourself while you're doing that work. Because we do forget to do that. We're the worst offenders of self-care, even though we preach it like it's the Bible, and we're the worst at it.
And I think they say a year at our careers, like 6 years at other jobs, just for the amount of stress and stuff we put our minds and bodies through. So yeah, I feel that.
And most of us come with our own stories into the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of weeks you have to really make sure what's mine, what's theirs, and be very careful with that when you're in a meeting of 13 adults who are all feeling tense. It is a lot of, again, mental fortitude, almost kind of diving into those dark places and not getting lost with our clients.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Whew.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot.
It is. I feel it.
I feel it too.
Yeah, the temperature just got a little more hotter in here after that.
I remember there's a college in Nashua. A person that I went to school with, she was in a cohort above me. She had asked me to go and talk to the social work students. It was their first course in social work at the college. And can one of my students interview you? You know, what is it like, working in a community mental health center? What is it like being a social worker, the licensing process, all that stuff? I said, sure. And the one thing that I've said to the class and to any of the students that interviewed me was, I strongly encourage you to do your own work before you walk into a room with someone else.
Well, yes, yep.
That's the first thing you need to learn.
Yeah, a lot can happen when you don't. I mean, some pretty serious stuff when you are, if you're already going in there playing because of your child, that's what I do with a lot of the youth. I have to teach adults, just because you did that growing up or just because you think that's okay, it does not mean it applies in a trauma-informed building. Because a lot of people come in, well, my dad did that or my brother did that and I turned out fine. And I always challenge people, I'm like, did you? Really unpack that a little bit there.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's explore that.
Yeah. Well, and that's an example of dissociating. Like, you have it bad, I don't. So it's like, I don't have to deal with my stuff now because it's bad for you, but not for me.
Realize, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I've had we've had kids where we have to do physical managements because, right, they're not regulated. We don't want them to jump out a window. So there's times where people have actually fallen asleep in the middle of crisis because their body's dissociating, putting in that, when we looked at combat veterans who put their hands in ice water, they were able to keep their hands in there 30% longer. So we looked at what is trauma doing to the blood, and they're creating like 8 milligrams of morphine-like chemicals, which is like, they would give you that for a crushing chest pain in the hospital. So that physical dissociation, that mental, it's deep, it's real. And when people don't think it's real, they're like, oh, look at them pretending to fall asleep in the middle of a crisis.
Mm-hmm. So much easier to judge than to understand, huh?
They're manipulating, they're doing it again. Yep.
Mm-hmm. All of our lovely words in the therapy world. I'm like, I would say to people, I don't want to hear that word. I don't want to hear manipulating, self-sabotage, and lazy. Mm-hmm. It's so judgmental. And, and one of the other big diagnoses I worked with was borderline personality disorder, which, probably 97%, if not higher, had some significant trauma history, right? And so clients would say to me, so what kind of medication can I take for borderline? I said, nothing. I said, I'm going to explain to you in very simple terms what borderline is. You've developed a skill set to survive your trauma, and you are here today because you did survive it. However, the skill set you're using no longer works because you're not living in those situations anymore, though not always the case because some people still are. They may be living in the same home with the abuser. And I say, you can relearn new skill sets.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
they
work
don't
with
realize
trauma.
that. Yeah, they don't realize that because the opposite of trauma is curiosity and imagination. And so many people don't even get that that's so hard for some of our adults and kiddos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, Stephen, you mentioned something about tips and tricks and something.
Yeah, any tips that you would give to someone who's listening and might be realizing, I have had trauma in the past, or I'm experiencing it now, or they start to build their awareness? Because I think that's one of the scary things, right? Is like when you don't know you have something, like you kind of do, but you don't, but then you're like, it's like going to therapy and it gets worse before it gets better because all the things start to come up in their bodies and they're like, what the hell is this? Or they react more in their relationship. So are there any tips or tricks that you can provide for people that work either with, the kids or with adults that can help them, like manage their stress level to get them through that moment.
Absolutely. So I think just to start, humans do really well with predictability. So I always tell people, before you do any trauma work or go to a therapist, start with basics, right? Are you eating? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you too hungry, lonely, angry, tired? Really having people take note of like, well, what are you feeling? What are the things you don't want to admit? You know, a lot of people in trauma work is admitting for once, like, I'm not well. I'm scared. So I feel like sometimes when people are listening to this, it might start with, if you're listening and you feel some stuff stirring up, sit with it. Maybe say it aloud, what might be stirring under there. I'm scared. I'm lost. I think I'm in a bad situation. And I think once, listeners can maybe sit with what might be there, right? That dissociation. I may not want to fully realize how stressed I am or how sad I am. I think just letting that come to the surface for listeners is the first step. It's like you're just letting what is there, what's been fighting, come. And I think the other end of that is good trauma-informed assessment and care. I've heard people time and time again go to therapy and have horrific experiences, not because that therapist isn't good, but if they don't have that skill set, if they don't understand dissociation, flashbacks, the difference between one simple trauma event versus 4 or more, and how that might look in therapy. I think one is just sitting with your truth, admitting some things maybe tonight that we talked about that I resonate with that might be me, and then from there, don't do it alone. Don't reinvent the wheel. Find people who specialize in it, who are jazzed, friends or others who will listen and get it, and start to find your community. Because I always say, you can do all the trauma-informed work ever, but if you don't have a community while you're starting to explore that and heal, it's just really hard for long-term success. So I think a part of it is just, sitting with it, really taking note of what was stirred up, and whether we're talking about systems or some of the topics, and then going to find somebody who can safely and not gaslight you, not always be talking about forgiveness, because I'm very testy about the word forgiveness with trauma. I feel like there's this, you need to forgive your parents, which yes, but if you're still around a psychopath or an abuser, forgiveness might not be what this traumatized person needs. They might need legitimate steps to get their brain out of their super stressful situation that's causing dissociation, flashbacks and all that. So I think if people, really are honest with themselves and allow themselves to feel it, and take note of honesty. Are you taking care of yourself? Where are you cutting corners? We just did a self-care activity where I said, can people really be honest on what are the barriers for taking care of yourself in the winter? I'm like, oh, well, once I stop moving, I can't. Once I see rich food, I eat as much as I can. So really just being honest with what we're doing, because I think that leads us to where our childhood was, right? Everything we do or don't do right now is because of some experiences that brought us here. So I feel like people should just really reflect and not go on their phone after this podcast, not distract themselves, and really just sit in some silence in themselves and see what comes up. And then maybe just seek that community and start to really learn, what does the body have to offer, right? Because there's people who have all these physical symptoms or diseases that none of the doctors can find help. But when they do trauma work, I'm not saying it's a magic bullet. I am saying some really cool, fascinating stuff has come out of the body in trauma work. And that just starts with noticing, I think.
Right. And just to piggyback on that for a quick second, is more about how trauma, stress, impact the physical health, right? And we see higher prevalence of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, diabetes. And when you talk about just being present and being aware of how you're feeling, and are you eating, are you sleeping? Are you following up with your doctor? Are you taking care of your physical health as well? And things like that. I think it's whole person.
Yeah.
Centered, right? We can't compartmentalize a human being. It's a whole person, and all the systems have to work together. And I think that's where the compartmentalizing, even within the body, from the brain, from the body, from the physical health, from the mental health, spiritual health, whatever it is, and bringing those systems together to work. So if our systems outside don't work that way, it's hard for us as individuals or human beings to do that for ourselves internally. And so I think that's it's good recommendation of just being able to sit with it and then reaching out for help or support when you're feeling like that's a little too overwhelming for you, because we don't want people to sit with it and then go down that deep dark way and get stuck there. So it's more about just witnessing it and then coming up with a plan on, now what do I do with that honesty that I've come up with for myself.
Yeah, and some people think I'm doing some magical thing with dissociation, and the first thing I start with, how do we increase daily living? Sometimes it's as simple as that, like we are in such bad situations financially, medically, that our body cannot possibly sit there for so long, so I start with basic stuff, and people think, I have all this specialty or all these tools, and it's like, no. What happens if you drink water or eat breakfast every time you skip it because you think it's not worth it? What's that going to do for you, maybe for your mental fortitude or regulation? A lot of cool stuff that does not have to be complex, that can really start, changing your life, telling the truth, taking care of yourself, prioritizing yourself. It's like this radical act, that opposite of the trauma land.
Right.
Love it.
Well, I think it's interesting too. There was a video that I saw on TikTok or Instagram of someone who read this huge article based off of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and was basically debunking it because they were like, he went to go study a tribe and it went against what his initial thoughts were. And then when he came back, he did not publish his paper because he knew he would have gotten made fun of in the professional community. And it went over how self-actualization is like the top, but in the tribe, that's actually the bottom, and it happens in a community setting. So it's the community supports each other. They're not your kids, but like as a community, you all help where and when needed. And obviously there are consequences or whatever you want to call it, that if they're not meeting the expectations of the community, they can get kicked out. Maybe they can come back in if they're willing to work on themselves. But what you were both talking about of how when we're, even in our society, we're so isolated. And I think that's a huge thing that is impacting our mental health. And we don't have that community anymore, right? Like even, I don't know, I would say my grandmother's or my mom's generation of like when kids could go out and you have to be back before the sun comes down. And now it's like you don't know your neighbor. And so you don't have someone to help you. And so now you have kids, you have a kid, and then you're like, you don't have support. So you'll have postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. And then you're like, because you don't have that support. And yet communities in Mexico, you have a kid and the community will literally take care of the child so that the mother can recover before she has to take care of the kid. So community is like a huge part. I think the hard part is like when you don't have it. So when you think about even tips for kids and teens, like what would be something that would help them, because it's good for them to have an awareness, but how would they create community because of being where they are and being like, no one cares about me. I have no adults who are going to reach out. So if there's a teen listening, what would be something that you could offer them to kind of help with their stress management or with their traumas?
Yeah, I think the really cool part, as much as there's some lacking resources, the reality for teens there's a lot of other adults who've been through what they've been through. And if sometimes they get over the fear of asking, or the shame or the guilt, right? I've had people, I'm not going to a food bank, that's too shameful. But I think if they can get past that, there's a lot of adults who have resources, knowledge, and just things that you can't imagine. I mean, there's been lives and trajectory changed by just asking for help when you really need it, even if it's shameful, even if it's terrible, because, again, community. These are strangers that we're meeting in our place, but when they ask for help and they tell us what they need, even if maybe their parents never cared, daring to ask again, we can do some really cool stuff. And, when the kids do ask and they say, I have nobody, we find them people. We do family finds. We'll search the whole state and the globe, calling people and asking if they knew they had a relative. We'll go to the courts, and, a lot of teenagers, especially in foster care, don't realize they have a lot of power. It is a powerless system sometimes, But when you do it right and you have a clinician who supports you like me, I'm in court just, going at it for my clients, like, there's a lot out there that people don't realize you can still access. I had kids who felt like they could never go to college, and finally a kid asked about it. He was just thinking about it, but never asked. And then we found him a tuition waiver and got him free college, so he didn't have to pay for it. So I think the first step is asking for it, searching community. Don't marinate in the sad juices, don't marinate in the stress. Take it as a stop sign to redirect and find someone that can help you manage that. Because they say, like, you don't always need a community to survive, right? You need it to thrive, I think. But research study says a teenager just needs one person on their side to survive some of the most horrendous things possible. I think it really is just searching for help, because it's really hard for a teenager. It's hard for adults. So imagine a teen trying to get resources on their own when most adults are like, I don't even know how to get help for rent right now.
Right. Very true.
Does that answer that for you? Or are there any things maybe I can go deeper on for tips or?
I don't think so. I'm just thinking because I feel like it's common, like, right, working with anyone. There's always the yes ands or the but people. Do this, do that, right? How many times are we gonna have this? We're probably gonna always hear this conversation, like sleep better, sleep more, eat, drink water, move. Whether you want to move, whether you exercise or just go for a walk, right? So we have these things where we consistently say them, and then the other part is it's on them. So it's making the decision to say, I don't like where I am.
Saying the truth. Yeah.
And what little things can I do to start making the changes, right? Because I think as teens, there's very little control that you have because you're dependent on your parents, your caregivers, foster parents. And so it's about, I think that's the hard part too, right? When we think, oh, like you're a kid, you're going to be an adult soon, so you need to figure it out. But then it's like you don't have that ability to be a kid, and you're an adult-ish.
From you, yeah.
And so, so like you said, the truth. So like at least being like, at least if you can acknowledge I don't like where I am, and then focusing on the things that you can and can't control, because I think that helps you to at least get it out, even if it's writing it down. These are things that I can't control. These are things that I can control. And so then just looking at the things that you can control and working on that, because again, like you kind of said, if you focus on the negative, you get stuck there, and then it just kind of keeps you in that spiral.
Yeah, I always say too, like, look for the exceptions for teenagers. If that one time that bad thing didn't happen, what was different? Was it maybe you had your friend over, maybe you tried that, like, really not reinventing the wheel? What are the exceptions, and why did those few simple things might have just kept that thing from happening or made the thing you wanted happen? Sometimes it's right. Start with mandate plan. When was the one time you didn't relapse? When was the one time you didn't get into a fight? And can you tell me a little bit more of what happened, and reflecting on your life? Like, well, I know things are bad, but why are those few things working, and really reflecting on, like, what's helping?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But still hard to do.
It's always easy to say and hard to do.
Yes.
And it's doable.
It is. It is. As evidenced by, we are all having this conversation. We have survived our lives, and here we are passing it down in some cool ways.
Exactly.
Well, it was definitely a pleasure having you on. I'm going to say early, like, we'd love to have you back again, because these conversations, I think the more we have them and the more people, this is a part of helping people to be educated and to learn more, to know what's out there, because they might not know, again, or they might not hear about, they might experience trauma and things like that, but they might not be able to kind of be in a space where it's that one podcast or it's that one video and it clicks and it helps them to make that change, because then they're like, oh wow, I listened to this podcast, and they feel validated, because we're not judging people here. It's just, these are things that you can experience, and then there is another side that you can get to and build that support.
I am very happy to have been invited, and I'm very excited to chat with you all again in the future.
And we are definitely excited to have you back in the future on additional episodes, as there is so much more information that we haven't shared. And so it'll be awesome to kind of break it down and just help others understand trauma, the impacts of trauma, and how they can work through it. If you are curious to learn more about what Gabe does, you can go directly to his website. It's going to be his full name, Gabriel Vega, V as in Victor, E, G as in giraffe, A as in apple, counseling, PLLC.com. So again, that is Gabriel Vega Counseling, PLLC.com. He provides services via telehealth as well. So if you have any questions, just go to his website. You can send him an email. And if you found any value in this episode today, I would encourage you to go to YouTube and look up the podcast. Again, Mental Health, It's a Trap. Find either this episode or maybe even any of the other episodes that you liked. Give it a thumbs up and subscribe. When you do that, it's going to help our reach so that others can find our podcast who might, again, they might feel alone, they might feel isolated, they might feel like no one understands them. And as we have more guests on to share their stories, our hope is to kind of help to bridge the gap where people can feel more connected and get more tips and tricks to kind of deal with whatever situations that they may be going through. And mental health impacts all of us. And so we thank you for listening. And if you have any questions or comments, please let us know. Take care.